Mr. Warnock, thank you for speaking with me today.
Well, thanks for your interest.
So let's just start out with the historic nature of an event like the coronation of a new king, the first time that a sovereign will be crowned in more than 7 decades in connection to the British monarchy. What do you make of that?
Well, it's an important event. I'm pretty old, and Queen Elizabeth was the only monarch that I knew in my entire lifetime. So, it is the passing of one era and the beginning of another. From a sort of government and politics perspective, it's a part of the continuity of government in Canada. Our sort of core operating software, if I could put it that way, is a British parliamentary system in which the top executive power is the crown, and it's important that role pass from one monarch to another seamlessly.
And what are you expecting in connection to what it might say moving forward in the relationship between Canada and the monarchy? Some people feel that perhaps Canada and the monarchy should, separate ways. Other people feel that, they are very much connected and attached to the monarchy. How do you balance those two perspectives?
Well, I feel very strongly that that's not an issue that we should reopen anytime soon. It's very difficult. It's polarizing and divisive at a time when we need more unity. It's incredibly hard to amend our constitution. You need unanimous agreement of not only the federal government, but 10 provincial legislatures. We'd have to work through the problem of how to secure meaningful Indigenous consent. There'd probably have to be a national referendum. I think that energy and effort should go to more pressing challenges like climate change.
And how can the relationship, just before we conclude, a lot of people, when the death of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II occurred, a lot of people were bringing up the relationship between Indigenous people and the Crown. How can that relationship, from your perspective, be improved? And do you think there is anything that the new king, King Charles III, could do to perhaps show some sort of solidarity with Canada's Indigenous peoples? Maybe touch on that a little.
Well, part of our constitutional monarchy is that the monarch stays out of day-to-day politics, and so yes, there's an important institutional relationship. The treaties of many Indigenous peoples were signed by with the French or the English crown, and they still are living, breathing legal and political covenants. So Indigenous people feel a strong attachment to the role of the crown, as do the military, for whom the monarch is commander in chief, and military veterans who've served often feel very strongly about it. So there is a strong attachment by a number of Canadians to the institution as opposed to the person.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Michael Warnock, former clerk of the Privy Council. Thanks so much for making the time. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for your interest. Nice to meet you.
Madam High Commissioner, thanks so much for making the time.
Great to be here with you.
Let's just start out with what the upcoming coronation will mean for the relationship between Canada and the British monarchy, as well as with other countries who have a similar style of government as Canada, with a constitutional monarchy giving the monarch kind of symbolic powers with an official representative with the Governor General. What are you expecting it to mean in regards to that relationship?
Well, when the British Foreign Secretary was here in Canada earlier this year, he said, talking about the UK-Canada relationship, that, the UK has lots of friends around the world, but it's different with Canada. We're family. And I think the fact that we share a monarch, that the king is simultaneously the King of Canada and the King of the United Kingdom, is a really good way of symbolizing that family. We share a common set of values that the king embodies. And this coronation is a moment where all of that comes together. We see the stability of our democracy and our shared values celebrated on the world stage.
And moving forward after the coronation of His Majesty King Charles III, obviously a lot of people, when the death of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II occurred earlier in September, the conversation about the relationship between the monarchy and countries who are connected to the monarchy was happening in great detail. What do you make of the argument that some people are making that the monarchy, for example, with Canada's Indigenous population, how can the new monarch mend that relationship and make it better so that people like Indigenous peoples can have confidence in their system of government?
Yeah, well, I suppose I'd say that the King has visited Canada a number of times. He's been here 18 times in an official capacity. He's travelled to each of the provinces, and in all of those visits, he spent a huge amount of time talking to and listening to Indigenous leaders and really understanding what that means for Canada. In terms of his relevance, he has said that he prioritises 4 things, and that is community, youth, sustainability, and diversity. And for me, when I think about Canada, those are 4 words that really resonate with Canadian values as well. The work he's done on environmental causes, which spans back decades, not something now we're all talking about the environment, but he's been talking about this for decades. And it really strikes me that there's a huge amount in common between those things that are dear and important to the King and those things that are dear and important to Canada.
And obviously, Queen Elizabeth II was a monarch who had served for a very long while. A lot of people who are currently alive today, that was the only monarch that they had ever known. What are you expecting King Charles III, as he officially is crowned and the first sovereign to be crowned in more than about 7 decades or so? What are you expecting that to mean? And just overall, what are you expecting to take place with the coronation?
Yeah, you're right that it's a funny thing. The Queen came to the throne in her early 20s, before there was social media, and then, spent many, many years, 70 years as our Queen, the only Queen many of us have known. And so we really got to know her in that capacity, whereas the King comes to the throne with decades of life experience. So it's really a different kind of feel to it. But I think that means that what we'll see is him continuing to value those things that he's valued to date. So those things I talked about, I think he'll continue to care a lot about the environment and to put a lot of emphasis into that. A lot of thought into youth. For example, he set up the Prince's Trust, which looks at supporting disadvantaged youth, and continue to think about how he can bring communities together. Those are the things that over decades have really mattered to him. And I think we'll see him continue to prioritize those issues.
And just before we conclude, how can a country like Canada move forward with the coronation of King Charles III, improve the relationship with the monarchy? What are you expecting it to mean for that relationship?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And obviously the government of Canada is the sort of owner of that relationship. But what I know is that the King really likes Canada. There's a great quote from one of his trips here before where he said something like, every time I come to Canada, it seeps a bit more into my blood and really becomes a part of me, or some such thing. I think, he'll be keen to get here. He'll be keen to carry on that conversation with all the people in Canada in all of its diversity, and to continue to think about how he strengthens the relationship.
All right, we will leave it there. That is the British High Commissioner to Canada, Susanna Gushko. Thanks so much for making the time. Really appreciate it.
Great to talk to you, Wyatt.
And of course, it will be a historic day with the coronation of King Charles III. Joining me now to discuss some of the latest on that is Peter MacKay, the former Defense Minister and former Foreign Affairs Minister. Peter, thanks so much for making the time.
It's my pleasure, Wyatt. Nice to be with you again.
Let's just start out with the historical aspect of this, what it might mean for Canada, the relationship between Canada and the monarchy. Some Canadians feel that given the fact that the monarch only has symbolic powers in Canada, that it might be time to look at perhaps having the monarchy take up a smaller role in Canada. I guess, what do you make of some of those arguments?
Well, firstly, I think the monarchy has been kind of a mainstay in a lot of people's lives, not in a substantive way or something that had a profound impact on their day-to-day lives, but it's been part of the traditions of our country going right back, in fact, to the very origins and before, in fact. And so the royal family is something that many people, certainly myself, my parents and grandparents grew up with. Whether this is a tradition that should continue or not, and whether symbolically it will remain part of people's daily lives, is really not something that the government can control per se. If there was a referendum, I suppose, to sever ties with the monarchy, that might impact on this. But it's really now something of choice, whether people decide to follow the royal family, and as many will probably take part in watching the coronation of King Charles. And of course, we have many symbols in terms of our money, traditions. The Canadian Forces regiments have attachments to the military. And so it's part of the fabric of who we are in many ways, but not perhaps as important as it used to be.
And what do you make of the relationship between the monarchy and certain segments of the population in Canada? Particularly, you could look at Canada's Indigenous population, something that when the death of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II occurred, the conversation about the relationship between the Crown and Indigenous peoples was happening in great discussion. Do you think those discussions may continue? And what do you think someone like King Charles III or other people who are directly associated with the monarchy can do to try and repair relationships, not just with Indigenous peoples, but with other populations who perhaps they haven't historically had a great relationship with?
Yeah, that's a fair comment. And the whole issue around colonization, of course, is tied into the monarchy in many ways, and Great Britain, of course. And so for Indigenous people, they view the royal family and the connections to the monarchy as quite different, just as they do, for example, with churches, for good reason. And so reconciliation and the discussion that you referenced, I think, will continue. King Charles, not unlike his mother and his ancestors, does, I think, understand and perhaps appreciates in a more modern sense the necessity to put things in historical context. He is somebody who perhaps has a historic opportunity here to further these efforts of reconciliation, understanding. We've seen historic apologies. We've seen in fact, King Charles play a more active role from a monarch's perspective in pronouncements on global warming and calls for environmental action. That wasn't something normally associated with the royal family. So, one would hope that he and his son, Prince William, Princess Kate, that they will, or Consort Kate will continue to try to keep pace with the times, I guess is how I would put it, Wyatt.
Royal commentator Bonnie Brownlee joins me now. Bonnie, thanks so much for taking the time.
Glad to be with you, Wyatt.
Let's just start out with what you are expecting as the, I guess you could call it festivities, celebrations get underway, the first coronation of a British monarch in more than 7 decades. What are you expecting to take place?
Well, the city, which I'm going to this evening, is already decorated and ready. They've been rehearsing for the last few weeks at midnight with the horse carriages and the military processions. So the Brits are ready for it. They've been watching this unfold over the last few weeks. Some are happy about it and some are not, just the same as people here in Canada are feeling.
And what do you make of the relationship between the monarch and various segments of the population? For example, a discussion that I've been having throughout the program is the relationship between Canada and Canada's Indigenous peoples, how that relates to the monarch, to King Charles III. What do you think someone like King Charles will need to do in order to perhaps mend some of those relationships with people like Canada's Indigenous population?
King Charles has a lot of work to do, and he knows it. He's going to start taking a serious look at where, for instance, apologies need to be made throughout the Commonwealth, and of course with Indigenous communities all throughout the Commonwealth, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. So we'll see work being done. He's been working on it for the past few years anyway, and it became different when he was, king in last September. So He's got a group of people around him, and hopefully it won't be a long bureaucratic process before they actually start to reach some sensible a sensible look at what a modern monarchy will look like.
And what are you, just before we conclude, what are you expecting that relationship to be like moving forward, not just with a country like Canada, but with Australia, New Zealand, other countries who are connected to the monarchy in similar ways as Canada? And obviously this comes at a time when, after the death of Queen Elizabeth, Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, there were some conversations being had about to what extent should Canada stay connected in the way that it is to the monarchy. I mean, what are the future of those types of conversations, and what are you expecting for a country like Canada, again, Australia or New Zealand?
Well, in our country, we've seen some of the there's some polling been out recently that's showing that there's a slight down, a down in the numbers in our relationship about how we feel about the monarchy. So again, this is the work where I believe that some form of new narrative may have to approach for what the Commonwealth is and what our relationships are with it. Because, in many ways, you're going to be watching a ceremony on Saturday for a coronation that started well over 1,000 years ago. This is about the 39th monarch that's gone through this, and to some extent it even feels a bit archaic. So and some of the countries of the Commonwealth, I believe, will leave in the next year or two. So the whole reframing of what that relationship is the work that has to be done. And I do know that King Charles has a committee set up within the royal households now to discuss slavery issues and where apologies should be made and by whom. So that work is coming.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Royal commentator Bonnie Brownlee. Bonnie, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Michael Serapio, thanks so much for taking the time.
Hey, very happy to join you, Wyatt.
So let's just start out, obviously, with the historical significance of something like this, the first time that a new monarch will be crowned in more than 7 decades. Obviously, Canada's relationship with the monarchy is something that is very much in debate, you could say. A lot of people, given the connection it has to Indigenous peoples, some of them feel kind of left out in this process. What ultimately are you expecting as it gets underway, and what do you think it might mean for some of those relationships?
Well, it's really interesting because, of course, the Prime Minister and the Governor General, they will be attending the coronation. But you're right, this is, it's been marked that this is an inflection point when it comes to not only Canada's relationship with the monarchy, but really even the British people's relationship with the monarchy. And, not surprisingly, the support for monarchy is strongest in England, where, of course, it all begins when it comes to the Commonwealth. But here in Canada, as you say, there was just this Angus Reid poll that came out a couple of weeks ago, which essentially pointed to the fact that a majority of Canadians don't really want to have Charles as king, nor do they really want to have Camilla acknowledged as queen. And when it comes to the place of the crown in Canada, that is something that, in particular, younger Canadians would like to revisit. Not an easy thing, though, as you probably well know. It actually takes unanimous consent of all provinces, territories, and federal government to essentially remove the monarch, the King Charles in this case, as this country's head of state. So it would require unanimity, it would require a constitutional change, and no one is speaking out right now about reopening the Constitution to address this. But without a doubt, this is a relationship that many Canadians are thinking about. And perhaps that's not surprising, because many experts had pointed out that, the respect for the crown really was tied to Queen Elizabeth in this country, because the vast majority of Canadians grew up with Queen Elizabeth or was born into a country where the Queen was a fact of life. So now that it is King Charles that will be coronated, I think that's when the discussions happen. And in a lot of ways, I don't believe that Buckingham Palace is ignorant of that fact. They know that they do have a challenge on their hands. thanks to the I guess the democratization of news, King Charles doesn't really have a lot of secrets that we weren't a part of, including the affair that he had with Camilla while he was married to Diana, the Princess of Wales at the time. So I think all of that factors into the kind of feelings that we're seeing about King Charles in particular. But when it comes to monarch, the question does hang for many Canadians. What does the monarchy do in terms of Canada? How does it reflect the Canadian modern reality? Where, of course, the argument against that will be that the crown has been this symbol of continuity, that we are able to have changes of government, be able to far more criticize the head of government because the head of state is a separate entity away from that. So those are the kind of arguments that you will hear. And, you also mentioned the First Nations people. Without a doubt, the crown and the queen in particular, who they refer to as a grandmother, there is a special relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown because the treaties were signed on behalf of the Crown, not with provinces, not with, for the most part, the federal government historically, but with the Crown. And so I think this is for Indigenous people as we walk down this road to reconciliation. I think that's part of the conversation. Although what I've also seen is Indigenous people wanting to really remind Charles that he is not only the head of state of this country, but also has a particular responsibility when it comes to Indigenous communities in this country as they seek reconciliation and far more acknowledgement of what they have gone through in this country.
And you mentioned the question that a lot of people are kind of asking themselves in a historic moment like this is what is the overall purpose of the monarchy, in Canada's case, a constitutional monarchy, and what will it ultimately do for Canada? And I mean, you cited the Angus Reid poll that was unveiled. How does someone like, the prime minister, people in the government who are quite loyal to the monarchy, how do they convince, some of those Angus Reid respondents, for example, who aren't so sure that Canada is well placed within the monarchy, that the monarchy is something that, should exist and that Canada should be connected to?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if that's so much an onus that you can put onto the prime minister or to anyone really, unless they really do want to step forward and be an advocate for the crown. And I don't see that necessarily happening because, of course, as head of government, they are dealing with far more immediate issues for Canadians, receiving a lot of criticism on other issues. So that's what will really occupy their time. I think much more when you talk about or question how does the crown prove its relevance? Well, really, that does fall upon the crown. What's interesting here is that Charles, as Prince of Wales, he visited Canada, I think, more than any other member of the royal family. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that the Buckingham Palace views Canada as a key country within the Commonwealth. Us along with New Zealand and Australia, I think you could describe us as linchpin countries, because if we and our compatriots, Australia and New Zealand, were to ever decide to be a republic without the crown, that creates a domino effect. And I think they're already feeling that pressure, certainly when they had their Caribbean tour, when Prince William and Catherine had their Caribbean tour, they received a lot of criticism about the historic role that the crown has played in terms of racial oppression. They certainly are feeling the pressure of that same Republican tide within the former British colonies in Africa. And of course, when it comes to the Caribbean, the Bahamas essentially got rid of the monarchy as their head of state. So when you ask the question about relevancy, ultimately that's going to go to the king. It will go towards Buckingham Palace to figure out how they remain relevant here in Canada, and in some ways with the Governor General's office. But it is without a doubt a question and a debate that many Canadians are engaging in right now.
Joining me now is Jean Chrétien, the former Prime Minister of Canada, to discuss the historical aspects, the fact that this is the first time that a new monarch will be crowned in more than 7 decades. Mr. Prime Minister, let's start there. What do you make of the historical aspects of this, the fact that, again, it is the first time a new monarch will be crowned in more than 7 decades?
It's very important because the Queen was serving the Commonwealth and Great Britain with great style and devotion. And now, unfortunately, we lost her, but her son was the one to take over, and he's taken over, but he has been well prepared to play that role. I had the occasion to meet him in 1970 at the occasion of the centennial of the Northwest Territories. I spent 4 days in the north with him and the Queen and the Prince Philip and Princess Anne, and I was with my wife and daughter. So I started to know them at that time, and I want to wish him the best of luck.
And obviously, the fact that he is being crowned this coming weekend is a result, as you mentioned, of the unfortunate passing of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. You were Prime Minister during about 1/7 of her time as the official monarch of Britain and other countries who are in the form of a constitutional monarchy like Canada. Perhaps do you have any memories of Queen Elizabeth?
Oh, but I met her in 1968 when it was a centennial of Canada, and as I said, I met her many times, and she was a great monarch and a great person. And she was speaking in French with me all the time. She was practicing her French with me, and she gave me the Order of Merit. I was the 4th Canadian since 1902 to get this great honor. So I know, for a Canadian, I had an occasion to a very good relation with her over a long period of time.
And obviously, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and everyone else in the government had a very great relationship with Queen Elizabeth. From your perspective, how can people in the government of Canada, people in other governments, build as strong a relationship with someone like King Charles?
Oh, I think that it's part of our institution, and there's always a great respect to the monarch from the Canadian prime ministers. Nobody has ever been outside of that mold, and I think it's the right thing to do.
And a lot of people are also arguing that perhaps it's time to have a conversation about how the monarchy is used in Canada, how Canada is connected to the monarchy. I mean, where do you fall on that debate, and how do you think Canada should be related to the monarchy?
It will be it's extremely difficult for Canadians to change it because of the Canadian Constitution. To be obliged, if we would like to change it, we need the consent of all the provinces. And I'm sure that it will be very, very difficult to achieve. So, and it's working quite well. It's not a problem for Canadians. We have a Governor General that represents the King, and the system is working well. And in fact, it's a nice way. We need a president or a representative of the King because if there is a big problem in the government, they need someone to arbitrate who should be the next prime minister. If there is too many problems with the election of governments and minority government being defeated and so on. So this role is played in Canada by the Governor General, and if it was not a Governor General, we would have to have somebody else to play the same role. So there's no cost to Canadians to have the monarchy, and when they come in Canada, they are always welcome, and it's an institution that will be very difficult to change. So why to lose our time to debate it?
And a lot of people, too, are wondering about kind of the pomp and circumstance, so to speak, how the actual ceremony itself on Saturday is going to unfold. What are you expecting? The fact that a lot of world leaders are going to be together to see, again, a new monarch crowned the first time in 7 decades that will have happened.
Oh, but because, this is the most illustrious royal family around the globe, and Great Britain, there's 54 countries or so in the Commonwealth, so the people wants to be there, and they will be the countries that are close to Great Britain will be there. I'm sure the Americans would send either the president or I think it's his wife going, and then France and Germany and the leaders of all these countries will be there. And it is normal because we're all having good relations with Great Britain.
And a lot of people, too, are mentioning the fact that someone like King Charles III not only is a monarch, but also an advocate for many important issues that the government here in Canada is looking to address, issues like Indigenous reconciliation, something that is likely a good thing given the fact that, you know, with colonialism, et cetera, colonization, the government and King Charles III is going to need to mend their relationship with Indigenous people as best as possible. How does someone like King Charles try to repair the relationship with Indigenous people, something that was perhaps harmed during the process of colonization?
He has no political freedom, the prince. He has the right, the king, he has the right to have some views, but he cannot have views that are contrary to the views of government. It is not his role. He has to be very discreet about his political opinion on different problems. Sometimes they can speak, but they cannot do it in a way that it is causing a controversy within the land. So he has some restriction, but he has shown in the past that he was very preoccupied with the problem of the climate change and the problem of the Canada of Indians or slavery and all these problems that seems to be in the headline these days.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, thanks so much for taking the time.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.